Pastors on porn, really? I thought you guys as pastors were supposed to be the good guys. Well, today on episode 3, we're going to be talking about why pastors are not above sexual struggles and in fact probably struggle more than most. That topic on episode 3 of Pastors on Porn. Well, Vern here. Let me start by asking a really simple question. Are pastors at least as sexual as other people? Now, I know that sounds like a silly question, but it is worth asking. Maybe they're somehow different from the normal drives and temptations of other people. Now, you know where I'm probably heading by asking these leading questions. And let me just state the obvious. Folks, pastors are sexual people like everyone else. And only bad things happen when we fail to acknowledge that as a starting point in our reality. I mean, I don't want to throw stones, but I look at the struggles of the Catholic Church, for example, as they continue to wrestle with the ongoing and seemingly never-ending abuse allegations surrounding its leaders. Again, I'm not here to judge, but one of the realities that's often mentioned as you read about what's going on is the conundrum of their celibacy requirement. You know, pastors or priests are sexual people like everyone else, and how do they account for that in their present model? Now, not that Protestant churches or church leaders have a better record. I certainly haven't, and that's the reason for this podcast. But I do want to talk about a basic reality check. I mean, remind you of the obvious. Pastors or church leaders, Protestant or Catholic, throw in Buddhist or Baha'i, whatever, we're all sexual people. And not only that, we were all children and teenagers at one time before we entered ministry. If we had experiences being exposed to porn or acting out sexually, if we learned to medicate ourselves in sexual ways or experience trauma such as physical or sexual abuse, then those habits, the resulting ripples, they're ingrained and dormant like they would be with anybody else. Just becoming a minister, a pastor, doesn't change your history, your family of origin, your pain, your susceptibilities that you have in place before you enter into this season of ministry. So hopefully we can be at least willing to raise pastors up to the waterline of common humanity. But I want to go a step further. I want to actually say that I think pastors are even more vulnerable than the average person for some reasons. Here's the first reason I want to give you. I think pastors have internal emotional needs that make them susceptible. Okay, what do I mean here? Well, I'm going to go out on the limb here and use an example from university. When I was in university, I shared a dorm with a fellow who was taking a psychology degree towards becoming a counselor. As I got to know him, he shared with me his story of a broken childhood and how he became interested in counseling and helping others. His passion for psychology was partly fueled by his own desire to put the pieces of his life together in some sort of holistic and healthy way. As I observed him and some of his friends in his field of study, I realized his motives were far from unique, those who were exploring the whole counseling field. Now, at the time I was studying business and accounting, and I was really good at making quick diagnoses, and because I was in business, of course, I didn't have any of those problems or propensities, right? Yes, I was truly deluded there. So just wanted to say that. But here's where I'm going with this. When it comes to pastors, I know never to question why each person uniquely feels called into ministry. It's a unique experience, and it looks different for everybody. But I have been with pastors for close to 30 years. I know this. I know, first of all, they share a deep spiritual desire to make a kingdom difference and to help people. Yet I also know mixed in with this is a desire to experience a sense of personal affirmation. Well, of course from God. Remember that well done, good and faithful servant verse? Yeah, of course we want affirmation from God. But mixed in with that is also a desire to gain a sense of affirmation from others. Now, you might resist this idea. You might think it's this whole mixed motive journey. But I would submit to you, after 30 years of ministry and knowing countless and countless pastors, I think my experience bears this out. Now, take that need for affirmation, that internal emotional need. Now enter into a job where everybody, and I mean everybody, approaches you with a scorecard and a report card. It's a little bit like sports. I'm a football fan, so I recently heard the story of some Denver Bronco fans who started a GoFundMe campaign to enable the team that drafted this top-rated quarterback to drop this guy. I mean, I was thinking, man, can you imagine what it was like to be that pastor? What he was wrestling with. I think they've dropped him from the team now. I was thinking, boy, that sometimes doesn't feel very far from being a pastor. The way our stats are measured just follow different metrics. That need that we have for affirmation is challenged each and every time some person or family decides, you know what? God is calling us to another church. That sense of affirmation is challenged each time you hear the success story of how that church down the road is doing amazingly. Oh, revival's breaking out. People are getting saved. They're busting at the seams. Man, there's just amazing things going on down the road or across the street. Even if you happen to be leading that church, there is always the sense that an affirmation you're getting is really only conditional. Something that requires you to continue to keep the train going or continue to be everything that people hope and need for you to be. Now, when your sense of affirmation takes a hit, and it does over and over in this job, there is some easy ways to get a substitute dose of good feelings from that pretty girl who sits in the third row, or that favorite porn star who keeps telling you, you are the man. There's all sorts of easy ways to have that sense of affirmation met when you're feeling down. So that's the first thing I think that makes us susceptible. Here's the second one. I think pastors have relational job-related realities that make them susceptible. Now, porn has often been described as an intimacy disorder by addiction specialists. In this sense, the opposite direction of an addictive path is the path of connection. So how does that relate to the unique struggles of being a pastor? Well, if there's one common reality for most pastors, and studies bear this out over and over again, it is that they are isolated. I mean, yeah, we have lots of contact with people, and trust me, we always have a mental or a written list of people that we really should get together with. But again, studies show that most pastors have few deep friends. Most pastors feel lonely in their jobs and professions. And I guess the question is, how is that possible in such a people-related job? Well, the idea then goes back to this definition of friends. Yeah, we might have friends, but even the people that we call friends, especially those in the church, still seem to carry their report card with them in their relationship with them. Yeah, we're their friend, but they still see us at some level as a pastor, and we need to perform a role to whatever their expectations are. Perhaps some of my most painful points of wounding in my life as a pastor have been those, and when those who've called themselves my friends have decided at some point in their journey that I was no longer cutting it as their pastor and they needed to leave. To quote the writing on the wall to Nebuchadnezzar, Mene, mene, tekel, parsons, I think it was. And it was kind of like, you have been measured in my scales and found wanting. That was God to Nebuchadnezzar, but that's how it feels when people say that to you. And people can say the darndest things with you as a pastor because you're not really a real person. I actually realized this once when I was a staff pastor with my key leader, and one day he responded to me really emotionally. I think he even teared up, and I went, wow, he's actually a real person. He actually has real emotions. And then I realized when I became a lead pastor, yeah, people say things to you as a role. They don't actually think of you as a real person like other people would respond. All of that results in the cumulative effect of all these relational dynamics is for us to protect ourselves. I mean, it's certainly a huge temptation, or to isolate ourselves further. We've all had the thought and struggled with it. Since most people won't last beyond, and most relationships won't last beyond the first disagreement or fender bender, I'm going to keep people at arm's length and not allow them to get too close. Because it's going to go sideways anyways at some point. The idea of sharing our sexual struggles with friends feels especially risky. There's always the possibility that the very things you share will one day be used against you in a conflict meeting where you're trying to wrestle through a decision. I remember one conflict meeting I had where a friend vocally speculated, this was in the group, that the reason I was making a decision they disagreed with was because of my struggle with porn. I go, really? Had nothing to do with it. For many, a pastor sharing their struggles, especially sexual ones, could end up on the next board agenda. And that certainly doesn't fill us with warm, fuzzy thoughts. The reality is we all need a safe support system, and it seems difficult in most church settings. To be honest, it's one of the reasons why I began this podcast, and over the next number of months, I want to begin to lay down some tracks that can provide just some alternatives, positive alternatives for pastors who are looking for safe, secure, healing places as they wrestle with their own sexual struggles. So let me give you one more thing that I think makes pastors susceptible. Pastors also face institutional realities that make them susceptible. There's nothing wrong for church leaders and board members and denominational leaders to want to see churches that are associated with being safe, attractive places for people to come to. The Apostle Paul was concerned that that Christians would live in such a way as to have a good reputation with outsiders. There's also relational legal boundaries. I think churches need to honor that would require a pastor to step down. But here's the point. Churches are often, unfortunately, in the game of image management. They want it to look good. And they just naturally want to cover over the fact that churches and church leaders are full of broken people stumbling heavenward. There's a desire for churches and church leadership to hide anything that would tarnish the shine on their churches. There is an implied understanding that going to church would and should make you a better person. And nothing quite messes with that brand than a pastor who is struggling to properly display the finished product. Every wife that comes to church and drags her husband, or her husband comes, hopes that her husband would be that great guy. Just like who? The pastor. So in the name of risk management and having successful growing church, we often communicate to the pastor, we know you're human, but if you blow it in this area, you're out of a job. Yeah, you might, if you need help, here's a confidential number to call. We don't want to hear about it, otherwise we'll have to deal with it. But we just need you and this church to be that shining light on a hill. And so the myth of the pastor who rides the white horse lives on. Finally, let me say this. There's one last thing. Pastors have some practical job-related realities that make them susceptible. Now, most porn behaviors tend to cluster more towards white-collar people. Now, I guess you can make an argument that it's the different ways that maybe white-collar people think and process and relate to the world around them. Obviously, a lot more obvious reason is that white-collar people tend to have jobs more related to computers and technology, and that just provides more ready access points to available, sexual pulls and temptations. And here's a job reality. Pastors tend to have pretty much control of their time. They're not accountable for every hour like if they were working a 9-to-5 job. They can slip away in their minds or online or to an illicit location for an hour or two. They could easily cover for that in their free-range job. So, here's some reasons that I think pastors are especially vulnerable. Number one, and this just is to bring us to the normal place, is that we're a sexual people too, at least as sexual as anybody else. But also pastors have emotional realities that make them susceptible. They have relational realities that make them susceptible. They have institutional realities that make them susceptible. And finally, they have some practical job realities that make them susceptible. And I'm not even getting into the fact, the idea of pastors and church leaders being an obvious target of the enemy. The verse around, if you strike the shepherd, the sheep will scatter. Remember that one? That's an entirely a whole other discussion. Now, I'm sure there's other reasons. Maybe some of these sound like an excuse to you. It's not my intent. The intent of me describing this is to help you get a clear understanding of the reality that pastors experience so that both pastors and those who support them can better face these sexual struggles. I'd love to hear from you. You can email me Vern at bandofbrothers@shaw.ca. That's bandofbrothers@shaw.ca. And I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear about your story, your struggles in this way. If there's anything I can share or questions you have, I'd like to deal with it in a future podcast. Until then, my hope is that you would continue to find God's hope and healing in your life. One of my favorite verses is this: may the Lord direct your hearts into God's love and Christ's perseverance. So I pray for God's blessing on your life and your ministry.